All right, welcome back to Behind the Madness. On part two of the show, we're going to be discussing what Ukraine is currently undergoing right now with the whole special military operation Russia is doing on it. On the last episode, we discussed on if war was going to happen and whether the logistics of war was going to hurt the economy of the European Union as much as it does currently. And today here I'm joined by
Elisei Kolesnikov Cherenkov, also Americanized into Elisei, as that is what I'm regularly called.
Alright. So Elisei, tell me about yourself and what your relationship with Ukraine.
So, I was born in the city of Donetsk, Ukraine, one of the current separatist cities, along with Lugansk. And as I'm a current permanent resident in the US, my family fled Ukraine after the conflict in 2014, the Donbass military conflict. My mother still currently works as a nondiscrete activist in order to stop the war, so she's a nondiscrete diplomat with a group that she organized after that conflict with my father, and that is the extent of it, yes.
Alright, and on February 24th, 2022, Putin did announce a special military operation in Ukraine. As you know, this was not unforeseen. Russia has built many armies in Ukraine before 2022. In I'm sorry about this, I might butcher the pronunciation, but Novocherkassk, the 8th Combined Arms Army, was re-established for quote-unquote defense in 2017. However, within the last 5 years, it has gained more artillery and more infantry. And that is a similar pattern you can see happen with troops in Belarus too, and all across the Ukrainian border. But what really set the flag off for me personally was the field hospitals.
Especially in villages such as Yelna, correct?
Right. The mobilization of Russian troops there was quite alarming and very concerning, especially for us. Well, we are not in direct conflict. However, the entire world is affected by this. And during January, troops in a joint army with Belarus stayed in Ukraine and continued to amass forces there in the following months before this all boiled down to the invasion.
Russia flaunted its ability to do joint training with the Belarusian corps, as they were essentially poking and prodding how much NATO would take of essentially Russian encirclement of Ukraine, because obviously you can see that Russia takes up almost the entire border of Ukraine to the very east, and then Belarus takes up a very large portion on the north side, meaning that they have 2/3 of the Ukrainian border occupied, essentially, when they joined Belarus. And Belarus, while they first announced that it was a joint training exercise with Russia, obviously the Russians didn't just overstay their welcome. They started setting up military bases right on the Ukrainian border, in Belarus as well. Now, the reason they were able to do this is just because of the huge railway system, but I think you have that coming later on, so I'll let you go on.
Alright, so we're gonna mention the railway system later, but just a quick note on that, the Russians rely heavily on their track system, and their railway system connects a lot of things. But of course, within the wake of the war, Ukraine has cut off most if not all of the train tracks into Ukraine from Russia, and they just blocked them off at the border. So, I want to talk about right now Odessa. It is the third largest city in Ukraine, and it connects Ukraine with the whole world through the Black Sea. So if Russia took Odessa, Ukraine would essentially be cut off from the Black Sea, as well as virtually the entirety of southern Ukraine would basically be lost. I know civilians are prepping for war. It's when, not if, Russia will come.
Right. So, the majority of the Odessan population has, I would say, either already prepared for war or left. So currently we do have someone staying at my house who fled Odessa. They were actually living there. It is a mother and her daughter that they essentially fled Odessa and they drove to Romania and flew into the US afterwards. And I would say that fleeing to Romania or Moldova is probably the only thing that families can do in order to stay safe. And even then, the path is uncertain.
Alright, now could you explain why Odessa is so highly sought after? What's the importance of Odessa?
So, being cut off from the only, essentially, body of water that you have near you is going to be a massive hit, and that will take the invasion Russian-sided at that point.
Right, and I know that people are piling sandbags, and mainly all the volunteers were accountants, bakers, teachers. They were not soldiers who were trained by the army at all. It's just the civilians just trying to protect their country.
Oh, right, that's correct. This is partially just because the strong sense of nationalism that Ukrainians feel for their country, and it is something to most definitely respect. See, the only problem is that the Ukrainian government is forcing all men aged from 18 to 60 to stay in Ukraine and defend the country in case of conscription, right? What this does is it divides many families, some trying to either escape the conflict or having, obviously, many troubles along the way, not only because they have to leave the country without the father of the family, who is in many cases the one who makes the most money, also because it's a part of their family that's going to be left to be conscripted into military service while they are moving beyond the country's borders. Like you said, the sandbags, those are essentially the starting points of the guerrilla warfare that will most definitely take place in Ukraine.
Speaking of the guerrilla warfare aspect, I know I've seen signs painted like "Welcome to Hell" and just completely blacked out and taken down from major Ukrainian cities and like a lot of places as well, because the Russians rely heavily on their maps and directions with the signs to navigate around the country, which is another aspect of guerrilla warfare.
Yes, that's very correct of you to point out, especially because the Russian army wasn't exactly trained on the geography of Ukraine. They're not fighting on their home turf. So what Ukrainians are doing essentially is they're just preparing for the worst, and they're making sure that when the Russians do actually invade, and obviously as they already have, they're going to have a very hard time navigating and attacking strategic points, making those signs actually relatively useful. Now obviously reliance on GPS does exist, but it is much more difficult than simply following road signs and having a consistent flow. And physical maps are to this day extremely outdated, so it is most definitely a good countermeasure for that.
Alright, now another big thing I want to talk about is going to be Twitter and basically social media, because as you may know, it's all over Twitter, always been trending, always on trending. There's many propaganda accounts by Russia and like fake civilian Ukrainian accounts made by Russia to disrupt everything else. So what are your thoughts on that?
So personally, I think that due to this war taking place in such a modern time that it no longer boils down to who has the stronger military. It is a war of information. There have been numerous interviews of Russian soldiers calling their families, saying that the truth is nowhere to be found, just because both sides are using heavy propaganda in order to either instill fear in, obviously, the opposing party, or spread misinformation to disadvantage the other one. So we can take this for example, right? Many say that Russia, near Crimea, had taken a port that had surrendered 89 people, while the Ukrainian side states that the 14 people there, which means there weren't 89 people there, fought till they were killed, all resisting being captured. And the same can be said with, like you said, roadmaps and frequencies. Now, radio frequencies are something very special in this case. So, like a fake Russian account posted fake frequencies of the Russian radio communication, right, on Twitter. But many people very quickly caught onto it and posted the actual ones. And the same could be said for fuel trucks, right, that are essential to the Russian invasion just because they don't have any railroads. The fuel trucks were then redisguised in order to be less noticeable, which Twitter noticed and started, mass retweeting, which allowed for people to catch on to this much quicker.
Yes, and I am glad on you bringing that up. The reason why Russia was changing the fuel trucks was that the old fuel trucks were not armored, and so civilians were just throwing homemade Molotovs at it and just taking down a bunch of the fuel trucks. So they rebranded them as these new civilian trucks marked with Z, and I'll let you pronounce that. It was like stand for victory or something.
Yes, for victory it would be Za Pobyedu, which quite literally means for victory.
Yeah, and that Z marking has been associated with pro-Putin and pro-Russia war against Ukraine. Another thing I wanted to bring up was that hacker group Anonymous, they've hacked many of the Russia websites. Government websites leaked a bunch of information, hacked Russian channels to give them real footage of the war that's going on.
Yes, and I think that did play a pretty significant role. Other than the current economic sanctions imposed on Russia, they're having one hell of a time with, yeah, like you said, hacker groups like Anonymous, who are just doing their best to thwart any attempt at invasion of Ukraine. So while this may prove unsuccessful in the end, it is most definitely helping the cause. What Anonymous essentially did is that they shut down all government websites, which stopped Russia from essentially doing public service. And not only that, military communication as well.
And that'll be all. Thank you for listening to part 2. There will be a part 3 coming out very shortly, probably at the time of release, where we will be talking more in depth of the actual people side of things in Ukraine, like family members and the overall civilian crisis that's facing. On part 3, we'll see you there. Thanks for listening.